Hope that you are as well. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip with me to Joshua chapter 11. Last week we finished up chapter 10 and we talked about, we wrapped it up with the finding the five kings in the cave, and then the conquest of southern Palestine. And chapter 11 actually goes through the conquest of northern Palestine. And so it's the last part of 10 and 11 kind of fly through some of these final battles that they have. And we're actually going to look at 11 and 12 tonight, because 12 just it's kind of a synopsis of where we've been. And so it just kind of runs through the kings that were defeated by Moses and by Joshua. And so we're going to walk through those. We'll spend more time in chapter 11 than we do 12. But this will actually wrap up the first part of the book that deals with the conquest. It deals with all the battles and stuff that they had to overtake the promised land there, or at least as much as Joshua leads into that 13. We find Joshua's old at that point after all these battles, and so they kind of stop with where they are. So we'll see a map at the end of our scripture stuff tonight, kind of looking at all the area that they captured. We're going to start tonight in Joshua chapter 11, starting in verse 1 through 5, and it says this: Then it came about, when Jabin king of Hazor heard of it, that he sent to Jobab king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were of the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah south of Chinneroth, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings have agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Once again, and I was reading through this week, and I'm like, I feel like with the way word traveled with what was going on, that people would have tried something different. But once again, we have a king that looks and says, hey, we're all going to gather together, and we're going to go and we're going to meet in this one place in Merom, there at the waters of Merom, and we're going to fight against Israel. And as I was reading through that, I was just, and again, I've told y'all I like to try and picture this stuff in my mind, but and I looked at some maps and stuff today, and so they all kind of come to this central place. All of these different kings, they come to this central place to fight against Israel. I'm like, so now all of these countries, these city-states, or what it is that you want to call these nations that are coming together, that have these kings, they're all coming to this place to fight against Israel. So Israel's only having to go to one place to fight these battles. And it hit me as I was writing stuff down this morning. I was like, it just doesn't make sense that they would continue to try and do the same things that they have been doing. But nonetheless, all of these kings, they get together. As this one king of Hazor, Jabin, he gathers everybody together. They've heard about the conquests of the southern part of Palestine. Now they're going in the northern part of Palestine. So they say, hey, you know what? All of us are going to band together. We're going to meet at the waters of Merom, and we're going to fight against Israel. The same thing that happened a couple of times. These city-states have gathered together. They all gather in this one spot, and although this hasn't worked well, they thought, hey, this was the best chance that they had. Now, there is something different about this time that we've not seen in all the other gatherings of people. Apparently, the crowd of people that they gathered together was vast in number. Because in verse 4 there, it tells us, it says, they came out, they and all their armies with them. And listen to this part. It says, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So this time, it's one of those things where God made sure that we understood that what he was about to fight was a very large number of people. As many as the sands on the seashore, according to what we find there in verse 4. So really that's the only difference in this tactic, is they've just got a bunch of people. They're all coming to this one place and they're thinking, hey, strength in numbers. We've got this. We've got a good chance with this because we have the numbers. We can all meet in this one central location and we can overtake Israel once and for all. We can stop them. I'm going to go ahead and tell you it doesn't work that way. It's not going to work that way. It's not worked that way yet. It's not going to work that way again tonight as we look into what happens after that. Verse 6 says, then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid. Joshua just, it's one of those things you look and go, he's just waiting on that. He said, don't be afraid. Don't fear. I got you. Because every time God talks to Joshua now, that's what he's starting with. He said, don't be afraid. You got to remember who's fighting this battle for you, who's fighting with you. Don't be afraid. And it says, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time, he said, hey, in just a day's time, I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. This one was the instructions were only slightly different this time. God said, hey, don't be afraid. He said, I'm going to slay these people before you, before the nation of Israel. He said, and then you're going to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. I was like, okay, well, what does hamstring mean? Well, if you look it up, it sounds even worse than the description I get in my mind is worse than what the word that I read there, hamstring. I'm like, okay, they probably just pulled something like I do when I try to run now. No, what happened is they would go and they would cut the tendons on the back of the legs of the horses just above the ankles, and they wouldn't be able to walk. So now their horses are no good. And then they would burn the chariots. So when he says you're going to hamstring the horses and burn their chariots with fire, that's what he says you're going to do. Very painful is what it sounded like. I read that and I was like, I needed to stand up and walk around. I got uncomfortable in my seat. It just, I got too good of a picture in my mind of what that would look like. And I was like, wow. But he said, don't worry about it. He said, don't be afraid. He said, the people are going to be laid out before you. He said, and then you're going to hamstring the horses and you're going to burn their chariots with fire. And so what they did, Joshua and all the people in verse 7, all the people of war, not all the people, just all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. And verse 8 says, the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Misrephoth Maim and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told them. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. So Joshua followed his orders yet again. But if you just glance over, you may miss there in verse 7 how they attacked them. And it's a little bit different now. There's been battle tactics for Israel all along, but this time he was like, hey, you just go and take these people. And so all the people of the war with Joshua came upon them suddenly. Israel surprise attacked this vast group of people. And because of that surprise, they fled. And it was just another mass slaughter of people as God delivered them into the hands of the Israelites. And so this time the tactic for them was, hey, we're going to them. Well, I know we've talked about a lot of different tactics. There's one they had a group of people that behind them. There was the ambush. They've had the times where they walked all night and straight into battle. This was one of those. They went straight to them, and they suddenly came upon them. So they surprised them, and they defeated them. The horses were hamstrung. The chariots were burned by fire, just as God had commanded. It didn't matter how many people there were. It didn't matter what that looked like. It didn't matter that the people were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore. God delivered them over just as He had promised Joshua, just as He had done so many times before for the nation of Israel. I tried to confirm what it was that I think that I saw sometime this week, and I could never find that article again. But from what I understand in this conquest of the Promised Land, we have it in really 11 short chapters, 12 chapters in the book of Joshua talks about this. And so it almost feels like, hey, really, we're just walking through like a month and a half worth of work here. But this took some time. From what I am fairly certain that I read, and again, I tried to find it to confirm it, but it was about the span of about 7 years that they walked through this conquest of Canaan. And so Joshua and the people have been fighting for 7 years to obtain the land that God promised them. And they only lost one battle, and that was their fault. There was nothing they were going to be able to do to win that first battle at Ai because there was sin in the camp. There was something that had to be dealt with at home before they could go and conquer the people. But they eventually would, and they continue to move through the land. But then something happens after Joshua and the people, they do what they're supposed to the horses. They burn the chariots with fire. But then look at verse 10 at what Joshua does here. It says, then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. Verse 12 says, Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. And I was reading that, I got to verse 13, and I was like, oh, why would we burn that one city? So my question for you, and I have a thought to it, from some stuff that I read this week. But my question to you is, why would we burn just the one city? Why would they burn Hazor and not the rest of them? That is one interpretation of it, is that they were going to go in and occupy some of these fortified cities. When the land is divided out, which will start in chapter 13 through, I think, 22 is the division of the land amongst the tribes of Israel. One belief is that they wouldn't have to rebuild all of these cities. Anybody else? God's plan. I like that Sunday school answer there. Go ahead. Yes. No, you're good. May have been some stuff there. Yeah. 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 And those were the two thoughts that I leaned on. Was Hazor was the one who originated this. Now, what they did in Hazor, I don't know. I don't know if they had, if it was a place where people came to worship. But we do know that Hazor was the place that the king, there in verse 1, Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of it, and he sent to all these other kings and said, hey, let's go. So originally my first thought is like David's there of, hey, this was the guy that looked and said, we've got a chance to take them if we all partner together.
Y'all don't come in and do what we want to. We're going to do what we just done.
Yeah.
Somebody wanted to kill our enthusiasm. They attacked Washington, D.C.
Yeah. We're not going into that. We're not going into that. And moving on from it. But yes, it is one of those ideas that this city had started this revolution. We don't know how long it took them to hear about it. We're going from verse to the next one. It looks and goes, and then this king heard about it. And so they gathered together and they went, whatever amount of time it took for that news to travel, this guy, for some reason, the king, Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard about what happened in southern Palestine, and he said, hey guys, he sent out word to everybody else and said, let's meet up at this one place, and we're going to be able to go, and we're going to fight against the Israelites. And he had to have believed they stood a chance, or he wouldn't have done it. He had to have believed that there was a possibility that they could overtake this. So I think that city became an example to everybody else around looking and going, hey, he had the idea of trying to capture us. And this is what happened to him. Because everybody was destroyed. None of the people were left there, but they burned that city. Yes. Yeah.
God just really wanted to do away with that sin, and that's what his intentions were for all of that, was to do away with the sinful parts of it, so the children of Israel went in and they weren't, subjected to the worship and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Some they were, some they weren't, but I think it's God just saying, I'm trying to totally destroy that sinful, whatever they might have been doing in that city.
And he may have. There may have been some kind of evil spirit in his mind looking and going, I can take him. I know they've got this God that everybody's here. That God's not anything to us. And so may have been pride. It very well could have been one of their gods that gave him that idea that he could go in and attack. Whatever the case was, it was utterly destroyed. And there's a reason that they didn't destroy the other cities. And I did read in commentaries of, hey, the fact that they were going to inhabit these lands, they're not having to build these cities back for the ones that, because God didn't say in there that they had to, that everybody had to go. Like all the people had to die. He gave them instructions on the horses and the chariots. He didn't tell Joshua, hey, you've got to do this. He doesn't speak against Joshua for doing that. So Joshua's still in his right of being able to burn that city. And that may have been one of those things is, hey, we're looking at the temptation side of things, and we're going to get rid of every bit of that if we can. And we know that. For us, it's so much easier for us just to completely cut it out than to leave it around, because we as people tend to go right back to it. We tend to slip into that because we don't always listen to the right voice. We don't always listen to the voice of reason, that voice of truth. And sometimes we look and go, there's just a little bit of it there, and that's okay. I can leave that. It's fine. That's not going to bother me because I did away with the big parts of it. Well, God knew for his people, hey, you can't have any part with it. If you're going to have part with me, you can't have any part with sin. And so they had to utterly destroy these people. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But yeah, those were my thoughts on what it was. Y'all hit those with some and added even some other thoughts that very well could have been the reasons why. I just thought it was intriguing that We find out in verse 11 that he burned Hazor with fire. And then verse 13, it says, hey, he didn't burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. They continue going on in verse 14. All the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed him. They left no one who breathed, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant. So Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. And so it's interesting to me that here they're bringing back Moses into this. That we're going all the way back to the commands of Moses. Because really it's been, hey, this is what Joshua told us to do, and this is what we did. But now, and it may be because here in chapter 12, we're going to get to where Moses conquered and what Joshua conquered as the leader of the Israelites. But it was intriguing to me that he pulled Moses back in. He said, hey, everything that Moses was told to do, that Moses told Joshua, they did. So it was even going back to, it wasn't just Joshua's idea. This was what God gave Moses early on before they ever started wandering in the wilderness. Moses had these instructions. He knew what they were supposed to do when they entered into the promised land. He shared that with the people. But those things are fulfilled through Joshua's leadership here. And so it was just interesting to me that Moses was kind of brought back into that. Verse 16 through 20 says this. It says, thus Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, and all that land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. So that's the first time we've talked really, because everything's been like, God's like, hey, tomorrow at this time, these people are going to be slain before you. And they go in and he's like, don't be afraid, because at this time I'm going to deliver them into your hands. And for the first time that we see in this, in verse 18, Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings, leading us into where they're going to go in chapter 13, that this was not just a quick march into every city, and it only took them just a couple of months or 6 months to do this. It was years that they walked through and that they captured these lands. Long time for these people to fight. But it's what they were supposed to do. It's how they had to obtain this promised land. Verse 19 says, there was not a city which made peace. This is important. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them. There's that phrase, utterly destroy, coming back up, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 19 and 20 were intriguing to me, just for the simple fact that we're reminded that there was not a city that made peace with Israel except the Hivites that lived in Gibeon. Now, they did it through trickery. We talked about that. They deceived them when they walked in there, but they were the only ones that tried to make peace. And because of that, we get verse 20, and it says, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy. Those are the verses that I have to really dig into, because those are the parts that I struggle with. The story of Moses and Pharaoh. I struggle sometimes just reading through it. I have to get to that point where I'm like, okay, God, why did you have to harden his heart? At the end of the day, I understand that God had to harden Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh was not going to do what it is that God wanted him to do. He was not going to fully release the people unless he had something drastic happen in his life. And so God had to keep pushing those boundaries of all those plagues until he lost a child, and then he said, okay, I'm done. And even when he pushed them out then, he still pursued them until they died in the Red Sea. And so I looked and I'm like, God, I just struggle oftentimes looking and going, God, why were you hardening somebody's heart? And in this instance, what I found in digging in that was their hearts were hardened because they wouldn't make peace with God. They weren't willing to accept this God of Israel as the one true God. They weren't willing to allow the nation of Israel to come into this land that God was giving them. And so they wouldn't allow those things to happen, so God hardened their hearts in a way that they went to battle with Israel, and they lost those battles. So for me, I'm reading through that, and I'm like, gosh, why did you have to harden their hearts? Because I struggle with that war. I mean, it's just been massive slaughter over and over and over and over again. And I know God's heart for people is that He loves His creation. But He's also a just God. And that's where we struggle, is we can't look at God as love, but He's also justice, and He is mercy, and He's grace, but He's also jealous. And there's attributes of God that make up our perfect God. There are attributes that He has that don't make sense in my mind. They may make sense in y'all's. I wrestle with those things, and I look and go, God, I know you love those people, but you delivered them to Israel to be completely slaughtered. It's because He had to. They weren't willing to make peace with Him. It's not that they had something against Israel. They weren't willing to make peace with Israel's God. They weren't willing to allow Him to give that land there. I think if the people would have said, hey, you know what? We don't want to fight this. We're moving. Very well could have just moved on out. They could have found another place to stay outside of the region that they were supposed to conquer. That very well could have happened. I don't know. If they were truly sincere and looking and going, oh, we don't want anything. Gibeon was saved. They were spared. They were deceptive, but they were spared even because of that, because they subjected themselves to the Israelites. And in essence, they did that to God. They said, hey, we don't want to fight against you, so we'll do whatever it is that will spare our life, even if that's slavery. The rest of these nations, when you walk through all of this, and it's war after war after war after war, and it's people that outnumber the sand on the seashore, that are all just utterly destroyed because they wouldn't make peace with God. It is. It definitely is. And that's the stuff where I look and go, okay, this is why I have to lean on His understanding. This is why I've got to trust in Him. This is why I've got to look and go, hey, it's a really good thing that Josh is not God, because this stuff doesn't make sense to me. Because my understanding of love, my understanding of justice, my understanding of mercy is not perfect. It's the best that my finite mind can wrap around an attribute of an infinite God. And so here, even in the midst of all these battles, God is continuing to reveal part of His character, that He is a jealous God, so He is going to get that glory from His creation. And that's going to happen.
What boggles my mind, if I got one, is the fact that God knew these people were not going to submit.
Yeah.
He knows where you're going to submit, and I know that we're going to submit. He knows our hearts,
Mm-hmm.
and knows what we are going to do and what we're not going to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's scary.
Yeah, it is. And that's that part, like in those phrases, hardening their hearts. It always takes me back to Pharaoh, but he knew what he was going to have to do to Pharaoh to get him to fully commit to what God wanted. And so he had to do the same thing with these nations, these city-states here that are walking and saying, hey, we don't like y'all coming in here. We're going to fight you. Well, they got those ideas because they weren't willing to make peace with God. And what that tells me is that if they were willing, some of this might have changed. It doesn't matter because they weren't willing. And God knew that. God knew their heart. He knew what they were going to come back with. He does the same thing with us. And we look and go, you know what, God, I don't understand why this thing's happening and I'm not seeing this result, or I keep doing this. And he's like, I'm still whittling away. At some point in time, this is going to look like what I want it to look like. But right now, you think you're making the progress you need to, but I'm still shaping stuff because I know what's coming down the road. See, and that the beauty of God is he gets to zoom out and he gets to see every bit of our story. We see little puzzle pieces that we're putting together that will eventually make up that giant puzzle that is our life. God is out there looking and going, I see all of your life in one instant. And so right now I've got to do this to prepare you for what's down the road. And you're looking and going, God, I don't like this. Trust me, you're going to need it. Yeah, but God, I don't like this. Just trust me, you're going to need it. Because he can see what's happening. He knows where we are, and we can't just give him lip service. We can't say, well, Lord, I'm sorry. I won't ever do that again. Lord, that's fine. Just whatever. No, God looks and says, I know you too well because I made you. And I created you, and so I can see your thoughts. I can see your heart. I know your motivations for everything. And so we might be able to fool one another, he looks and says, you're not fooling me. I already know. I see it all. And we've got to walk through this so that we can get to this next step. So we can get to that next puzzle piece. And it's incredible just looking at that idea. And it just reminds me how, and just really honestly, how insignificant we are compared to him. Far too many times I look and think that, hey, me and God are way too close in size than we really are. I would never tell you that, hey, you know what, we're equal. No, I mean, I know that. But how I treat God and how I respond to God oftentimes puts our ratio a lot closer together than it ever should be. Because God can see this stuff from an entire nation. He knows I have got to harden their hearts so that we can get to the place where we're supposed to be, because they're not going to change. They're not going to accept me. They're not going to make peace with me. And so I've got to send them into battle so that my people can come in and they can destroy these people, because they're not ever going to be a part of me. We're going to be like Joshua when dealing with Gibeon and stuff and going, it looks like y'all traveled a long ways. Y'all come on in. It's fine. Let's sit down. Can I get you something to drink? Are you hungry? The bathroom's down the hallway. Go ahead and take a shower. Make yourself at home. Because that's how we are. But God looks at all of this from that zoomed out view, and he looks and says, I can't have that around my people because it's going to destroy my people. And so you just see, even in all of this, of walking through these battles, you see God's character. You see his heart just shining through in this, and knowing that he had to do this to get the right result. And that's what I often struggle with swallowing. That's that pill that's hard for me to swallow, is that God looks and says, I have to do this to get to where I want to be, or where my people need to be. It's the same thing for us. There are things that we walk through. There are things that we do, we go through, we experience. He looks and says, I know you don't like it. I know you don't understand it, but give it time, because one day you'll see it. And just trust me that this is a part of my perfect plan. Well, it doesn't feel perfect right now, God. I mean, how many times have we said that? God, this doesn't feel perfect. I know that's what I'm supposed to say. I know that your plan is perfect, but it doesn't feel that way. Because, God, this hurts. And I don't see the reason. I don't see all of this, why it should be happening. And oftentimes he looks at me and says, Josh, you just got to trust me. I've got a plan. And if you'll give it time, if you'll allow it to hurt, if you'll allow me to groom you for just a little bit. They tell me that you gotta prune stuff to make it grow. You gotta trim stuff back, or it won't be healthy anymore. God does the same thing with us. He slowly prunes us back. And sometimes we're like, oh, Lord, you pruned a little bit too much. That's going to bleed a little bit. But he has to prune us back so that we can grow the way that he wants us to grow. And that's where we have to look and go, God, I trust you. I trust you in your infinite goodness, in your infinite mercy, and in your sovereign will through all of this. I trust you to do what it is that you're trying to do in my life. Verse 21 says, Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim, that's the giants, again, that we read about in Genesis, left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and in Ashdod some remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So for the first time we find rest. And also for the first time we see the word inheritance is put in there. Joshua doesn't mention that. Moses had talked about that, and Joshua will mention that a lot more in 13 on through as they divide this land, this space up for these tribes. But here we see the Anakim. Those are the giants, and the sons of Anak is who they are. And we see that they are mostly destroyed. They don't stay in the land of the sons of Israel. But verse 22 tells us that there are some that stay in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, some remained. So there are some that remain behind, and that's important for us to note because eventually, I think over in maybe it's 1 Samuel. Yes, 1 Samuel, we'll see some of these relatives come back in the Philistines, where Goliath stands before David. He is believed to be of a descendant of Anakim because of his size. And so the fact that some of them weren't destroyed, they didn't stay in the land. Some of them left, and God's going to use them in part of his story later on with David. And so just interesting notes that as you're reading through that and digging into commentary, you're like, okay, that makes sense that, yeah, they drove all these people out, but they didn't destroy that entire race of people because they weren't in that land area that they were supposed to take. And so we see them show up again in the story there in 1 Samuel with David and Goliath. But Joshua did what he was supposed to do, everything that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and then to Joshua, that's what they did. Before we go into chapter 12, I want us to look at the last map there, Brad, the second one. All right, I know this is not huge, but what this is all that green space is every part that they conquered, every part that Joshua and the Israelites conquered, all the way up north above the Sea of Galilee, all the way down there on the left side of the Dead Sea, on the right side. The Jordan River goes between the two bodies of water, the Dead Sea up to the Sea of Galilee there. So everything on the right, I say everything on the right, a good bit of stuff that's on the right was actually done by Moses and the people before Joshua started leading. And then they come over and they conquer everything there on the left and in the northern part there. But you're looking and going, well, why don't they spread all the way over to the water? And there's some conversation stuff that you read in commentaries about that. Some of that may lead into Joshua chapter 13 because they stopped fighting battles because of his age. He is, I think it's, they believed him to be in his 90s. between 90 and 100. Caleb was about 85 at the beginning of Joshua 13. So he was done fighting at this time here, but they captured all of that area. Now what I guess modern day Israel looks like, go ahead and pull that one up for us, Brad. The first map there. So modern day Israel, and I say modern, the historical development of modern Israel goes all the way down there to that Egypt coast, which is the dark green at the bottom left. And then it kind of spans up that whole thing. But they do go all the way to the water there. I think that's the Mediterranean. Yes, the Mediterranean Sea. So it does expand all the way over there. There'll be some wars. We know if you've done any kind of studying with the nation of Israel, it grows and shrinks. People take them over because guess what? At the end of the book of Joshua, you get into Judges, and the people are acting crazy. They're not doing what they're supposed to do, and so God doesn't honor everything when he says, hey, you know what, you're not supposed to be doing this thing. And so people come in and take some of their territory and back and forth there. But I did want you to kind of get a picture of all of this land that they had conquered. There's a really good chance if you have a study Bible that in the back of your study Bible, some of that stuff is spelled out there. I think mine actually says it's map number 2. Map number 3 says Exodus and Conquest of Canaan. So it's map number 3 for me. So it shows that may be a little bit easier for you to see. But that's all the areas that they walked through. And you can see their journey from Egypt and Goshen, where they settled in the time of Joseph, all the way to Mount Sinai and everything there. So they're wandering in the wilderness and all that. But just wanted to kind of get a picture of what we've walked through with the people. Now, chapter 12, and chapter 12, we're going to just walk right through it. It spells out everything that they've conquered. Like I said, it is a synopsis of all the stuff. And really, if you break it down in verses 1 through 6, you get what Moses conquered. And then in 7 through 24, you get what Joshua conquered. And so let's just go ahead and read through that real quick and see what's in there. Verse 1 in chapter 12 says, "Now these are the kings of the land whom the sons of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise, from the valley of the Arnon as far as Mount Hermon, and all the Arabah to the east. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon and ruled from Aror, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, both the middle of the valley and half of Gilead, even as far as the brook Jabbok, the border of the sons of Ammon, and the Arabah as far as the sea of Chinneroth toward the east, and as far as the sea of the Arabah, even the salt sea eastward toward Beth Jeshemoth, and on the south at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah, and the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Salakah and all Bashan, as far as the border of the Geshurites and the Megathites, and half of Gilead as far as the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Moses, in verse 6, Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the sons of Israel defeated them, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh as a possession. So you go through, and really, I had to go back and count and read through that a couple of times, but really there's just 2 kings that were defeated by Moses and the people. They had lots of different territories. They had lots of different people groups in it. And so those names can kind of all get entwined together. But Moses and the nation of Israel really only conquered 2 kings on that eastern side of the Jordan. But on the western side, where Joshua would lead the people through, verse 7 starts talking about that one. And there's a lot more kings that they defeat there. And we've read their stories over the past several weeks. But verse 7 says, "Now these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the sons of Israel defeated beyond the Jordan toward the west, from Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, even as far as Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir. And Joshua gave it to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their divisions. In the hill country, in the lowland, in the Arabah, on the slopes, and in the wilderness, and in the Negev, the Hittite, the Amorite, and the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite." And then it walks through the kings. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. The king of Jarmuth, 1. The king of Lachish, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. The king of Gezer, 1. The king of Debir, 1. The king of Geder, 1. The king of Hormah, 1. The king of Arad, 1. The king of Libnah, 1. The king of Adullam, 1. The king of Makkedah, 1. The king of Bethel, 1. The king of Tappuah, 1. The king of Hephir, 1. The king of Aphek, 1. The king of Lasharon, 1. The king of Madon, 1. The king of Hazor, 1. The king of Shimron Maron, 1. The king of Akshaph, 1. The king of Taanach, 1. The king of Megiddo, 1. The king of Kadesh, 1. The king of Jokneam in Carmel, 1. The king of Dor in the heights of Dor, 1. The king of Goam in Gilgal, 1. The king of Tirzah, 1. In all, 31 kings. 31 kings that they defeated as they walked through. And again, like I told you earlier, what I tried to find it again. I couldn't remember which commentary it was in, but I believe it took about 7 years for them to conquer all of that. And I think there's another 7 years of stuff where they divide out the lands and they take all of that. So my understanding, I'll try and find that, and we can correct that next week if we have to, but that's what I believe to remember. The really cool thing about all of this is we've been able to see some of God's character through all of these battles and what God desires in all these battles. But looking at what you find in these first 12 verses, there's a couple of things that kind of stand out, and it's that this conquest shows what faith can do. It shows what faith can do. Because these people were not the warriors that some of these other cities were, but faith allowed them to trust in their God and see Him do some really incredible things. But it also could have been one of those things where you look at it and go, okay, what would have happened if the 12 spies would not have refused to take the land? Because we don't get to the people that they talk about till the end of chapter 11. The people they were worried about were the giants in the land. They're like, hey, they're really, really big people, and they got a lot of fortified cities. So somewhere in their spying out of the land, they ran across the Anakim, and they saw these fortified cities, and they trembled, and they said, we're not doing that. So they refused to take the land. And so this conquest not only shows us what faith can do, but it also can be a rebuke to those who refuse to take the land. And it's one of those you look and go, had you just trusted me, we'd have been here 40 years ago. Had you just trusted me, we would have done all of this already, and every one of my children would have made it into the promised land. Those generations would not have had to die off because they weren't willing to go. And so it's just really neat to kind of dig into that part and look and go, okay, God, a lot of this stuff felt familiar. It felt like we've already read it. It felt like we'd walked through the same battles over and over and over again. But at the end of it all, it's a story of God's faithfulness with His people. His people were obedient, and God was faithful. And things happened that could only be explained by God doing what God can do. They would not have made it past Jericho had it not been for God. And yet they made it not just past Jericho, which was the first king that was mentioned there in verse 9. They made it past 30 more kings to conquer all the land that God had given to them. God was faithful because his people followed him. They were obedient. What a testimony that can be for us tonight is that God is always faithful. God sticks to his word far better than we can ever attempt to do. But he's faithful when we're obedient. He is good all the time. All the time. Yeah, he definitely is. Let's turn our attention to our prayer list. I know we've